Dear colleagues, dear fellow champions, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm Thomas Greminger. I'm the Executive Director of the Geneva Centre for Security Policy. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's Geneva Security Debate, together with my fellow international gender champions. Our objective in hosting these monthly debates entitled Geneva Security Debate is to inform, to provide new insights, to stimulate joint reflections on pressing security challenges in the short term. And in the long term, we are even more ambitious. We hope that these debates will allow us to shape a better and a more secure global future. The discussion we will have on gender persecution as a crime against humanity starkly illustrates precisely why women's equal human rights are central to our common security and why we as gender champions are prioritizing women, peace and security. We are clearly at an inflection point. As we witness the biggest rise in interstate conflict since the Second World War, it seems to me no coincidence that this is accompanied by a regression in women's human rights, with generational gains hanging in the balance. The question of how we collectively can work cooperatively together to ensure our security, indeed our survival, is highly political, and those politics are gendered. I'm a firm believer in multilateralism, the power of dialogue, and the need to overcome differences. The WPS agenda has helped us advance all three, galvanizing unanimous support at the Security Council in the year 2000, and commitment by 107 countries who have developed national action plans since. And I'm very proud to tell you that I coordinated the drafting of the very first Swiss national action plan some 17, 18 years ago. It has ensured that civil society actors are heard at the highest levels of governance and created multiple channels for peace building and conflict resolution. And yet, we have not done enough to ensure peace or sufficiently advance the Sustainable Development Goals. And clearly, the WPS agenda is experiencing the tensions. Inequalities have grown, generating mistrust, not just between states, but between citizens and their governments, businesses, international organizations, and the media. A polarization in values, priorities, and worldviews is challenging our national and global governance systems. The shift towards defensive policies and militarization is moving us away from prioritizing and protecting human rights. And abuses of power, like the extreme examples we will discuss today, which involve atrocities committed against groups based on their sex characteristics and/or gender, generate fear and perpetuate cycles of violence, discrimination, and marginalization. Progress, dear colleagues, is clearly not inevitable. And for the first time, we are seeing an ideological divide opening up within the next Generation Z. A recent Gallup poll indicates that whereas traditionally people of the same generation had similar worldviews, young men are now becoming more conservative and young women more progressive. This could have far-reaching implications beyond the ballot box. Dear colleagues, as leaders, we have a choice. We can step back and see how these questions unfold. Or we can step into the difficult questions and choices, listen to different perspectives, and seek common ground and creative ways forward. The new Agenda for Peace calls on us to step in. And ahead of the Summit of the Future, myself and fellow champions are choosing to do just that. This group has 3 aims. First, facilitate dialogue and strengthen international cooperation between member states, international organizations, and civil society to improve coherence and ensure prioritization of the WPS agenda within Geneva. Second, support the implementation of the Global Compact on Women, Peace and Security and Humanitarian Action, and encourage more actors to become signatories and make commitments. And third, collectively develop evidence-based recommendations and policy language that promote a human rights-based approach to conflict prevention, integrating the perspectives of diverse stakeholders. I also invite more of my fellow gender champions to join us in our endeavor. We have already a sizable number of members, as you can see from the speakers list. We are delighted that Ambassador Julia Fuentos from Chile is joining us, and we have support from the Netherlands and Lithuania. However, more member state members can help us to further bridge perspectives and ideas and match policy recommendations with realities. We may indeed run short on time as today's agenda is packed. We have 3 parts. Firstly, the opening by myself and by my co-chair of this group, Madeleine Rees, who is the Secretary General of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the oldest feminist peace organization globally. Secondly, a discussion with fellow champions on their perspectives on the WPS agenda and why we need this group, including an insight into the Global Compact on Women, Peace and Security and Humanitarian Action from Adriana Quinones of UN Women. And finally, a discussion on gender persecution as a crime against humanity, where Samuel Emonet of Justice Rapid Response has kindly invited Professor Valerie Osserfeld, a preeminent expert on the topic. To conclude, thank you, fellow champions, for embarking with me on this journey, and you, the audience here in the room and online, for your interest. I hope that today's discussion lays a path for a constructive year ahead for this group and the wider community here in Geneva and beyond. Thank you for your attention and for being here with us. Now, Madeleine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Thomas, for that introduction. Just to say it's really lovely to be here and to be partnering with GCSP on taking this initiative forward. I should start with a disclaimer. All of you who know me know that I am a human rights fundamentalist, which means feminist. And that's why I love this initiative. And I really think we can do a tremendous amount together to change some of the depressing things that Thomas was outlining as being our reality right now. I have great belief in Geneva and the Geneva mechanisms. And there's a very good reason for that. It's because we're all here. We have everybody that works on human rights has some sort of central focus in Geneva. We have the ability to take information from people all around the world and hear what is happening in their realities, the structural, the physical, the psychological violations that they're subjected to at the hands of states. And we have the mechanisms here to try and perform alchemy, to bring all that knowledge together, to bring what we have together, to actually transform their experiences into something which is forward-looking, which can actually change those realities. So we get to proper investigation and monitoring, proper scrutiny of allegations that are made, ways of finding redress, and absolutely vitally important, accountability for those who have perpetrated, whether it be individual or states. And we have here the ability to work with states to help them to improve their human rights records, particularly by the engagement of civil society, fundamentally important. Now, sometimes we're successful, sometimes we're not. And I think that one of the reasons why we're not successful is because we still have a siloed approach. I'm old enough to remember all the initiatives on joining dots that we've done over the decades to try to bring the community here together so we work really closely together rather than those silos. But we still do that so we don't bring all the abilities we have into that alchemy to make it transformative. The other reason we don't always succeed is because we're always looking over our shoulders at the powerful states, almost and always exclusively led by men and their geopolitical ambitions, which looks at security as militarized, as we can see exemplified completely by the paralysis of the United Nations Security Council when it comes to actually addressing the fundamentally important issues that face real people in real times. And that's another debate in and of itself that we have to confront at some point. And I agree completely with what Thomas is saying. We are at a tipping point. I think everybody is talking about it right now in terms of we can go either of two ways, or probably several ways. But there is definitely a huge threat to the international system as we know it, and to international law, because we have been ignoring it with impunity for far too long. And this is why Geneva is important. I've been saying for the longest time that we need to bring security here, not to look at the security that we're being offered from New York with the militarized ambitions that are exposed there, but to really look at what we've been talking about, which is about women, peace, and security. Yeah, we started it over there. We put language into resolutions, some of which we say are binding under international law because they are Chapter 7 equivalents. And it's all about the need to prevent, to protect, to ensure participation, and to make sure that when we are getting into that reconstruction reparation, women are part and parcel of that, directing what should happen going forward. We have utterly failed on that. We have some brilliant national action plans. We have wonderful people doing advocacy. We have UN bodies trying. But when push comes to shove, when you look at Ukraine, when you look at Sudan, and when I've just come from a briefing on Gaza, we have failed. Because the minute the big guns literally start rolling in, women, forget it. Gender, forget it. We'll get round to you later, and do please have an advisory board to tell how to work some sort of peace mechanism. Well, that's not good enough. So what we've got to do is we've got to recalibrate what we do here. And I think with all the other gender champions who are hopefully going to push for this, if we bring women, peace and security into every resolution, all the work of all the treaty bodies, all the work of all the special procedures in their multidimensional aspects, so we're consciously looking at how will this affect women, peace and security? How do we make sure that we are listening to what women are experiencing in real life, in real time, in the design of all of that? How do we do it? And how do we bring it all together? So it'd be everything from commissions of inquiry, fact-finding missions, thematic resolutions, all of it, country-specific resolutions in particular right now. How do we do it? What do we do? Who do we need to bring? Who do we need to listen to? And how do we actually stop looking over our shoulders at the politics of those big geopolitical players who are running roughshod over human rights, instead of doing what we need to do, which is shifting the narrative towards real protection, real prevention of conflict, and I would admit, then I think, a real possibility of peace going forward. So I think if we can do that through this initiative, we commit to it, we move out of our silos, we start thinking of international law and the principles of convergence that we need to bring those elements together. If we can do that and look up and see where our partners are and where we need to make those entry points, then I think we can have the possibility of the alchemy that is so greatly needed. So I think women, peace and security, all the resolutions, the participation, everything else, in all the work we do, shift the narrative, and then let's hope that the tipping point tips back towards us. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Madeleine. Thank you, Ambassador Greminger. We now move very swiftly to part 2, and I have a few of our champions here with me to share their perspectives on why, from their work, they're seeing the importance of women, peace and security right now. And I'd like to start with Mr. Phil Lynch of the International Service for Human Rights. And you can see all the impressive bios that are in the sheets in front of you or outside. Phil, if I could start by asking you why you're working with human rights defenders. Why do you see it important that we focus on women, peace, security right now?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation and the question. So obviously the right of women to equality, to non-discrimination, to meaningful representation, to meaningful participation is really at the heart of the IGC. As Madeleine was saying, it's very well established that communities are less cohesive and conflict is more likely when women are denied their rights, and that communities are more healthy, more inclusive, more prosperous and more peaceful when women enjoy equality and the right to fully participate in decision-making processes and all aspects of public and private life. You asked specifically about women human rights defenders, Fleur. Whether in the context of conflict prevention, conflict resolution or peace building, women human rights defenders play a really critical role in challenging inequalities, in providing essential services, in mobilising communities, in demanding justice and holding those in power accountable. And whether we look at situations in Afghanistan, Colombia, Syria or Yemen, we realise that this has been the case. The experience and the expertise of women human rights defenders is really essential to identify and to address root causes of conflict and violence, as well as to ensure that the experiences and needs of groups subject to discrimination and marginalisation are brought to the table. But it's really important to emphasise that the participation of women and the work of women human rights defenders is not just necessary for gender justice, it's also crucial for racial justice, for environmental justice, for political justice, for economic justice, for social justice. Justice is intersectional and requires that women are at the table. It's also important to acknowledge that the work of women human rights defenders really involves confronting and challenging power, privilege and prejudice. And it's precisely because of that work that so many women defenders are subject to threats and attacks from governments, from corporations and from other actors, amounting, as we'll hear later, in some instances to gender persecution, or even in the case of Iran and Afghanistan, to gender apartheid. So to summarise, I really warmly welcome the establishment of this group. I hope it can contribute to the meaningful recognition, participation and protection of women human rights defenders at the UN and a long way beyond.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to move swiftly on to our next champion, who's Esther Dingemans, who is Executive Director of the Global Survivors Fund. Esther, you're working with survivors of sexual violence, particularly in conflict. Would you like to share with us your perspectives? Thank you.
Yes. Is this working? Yeah. Thank you very much, Fleur, and thank you, Ambassador, for your opening remarks, and Madeleine, and for the invitation to be here. Yeah, I would like to zoom in on one aspect of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and that's indeed conflict-related sexual violence. And then within that theme, which I really believe deserves prioritization, just like many other themes, there's a particular aspect, and that is survivor-centered justice and accountability. As you all know, conflict-related sexual violence is unfortunately still part of almost every conflict. What is more, when the conflict is over, there is no peace, there is no security for those that are the victims, and that's usually women, but there's also men. They continue to grapple for years and years with the trauma that's been inflicted on them, the loss of livelihoods, the loss of respect, etc. The Women, Peace and Security agenda has seen a right, I think, increasing emphasis on justice and accountability. However, we also know that justice can be extremely slow, and particularly for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, who actually, in most cases, I would dare say 99% of survivors do not have access to these criminal justice procedures. So bringing it back then to survivor-centered justice, survivors keep telling us truly survivor-centered justice includes, like Madeleine was saying, reparation and participation in these reparation processes. I just want to quote a survivor from Uganda who is on our board at Global Survivors Fund, and she said, "Seeing a perpetrator go to jail is one thing, but being able to send your child born of rape to school, thanks to reparation provided by a government, is another. Both are justice. The first is unrealistic for most survivors, unfortunately. The second can become a reality for all survivors." And with that, I'd like to highlight a few positive signs, cautiously positive signs of governments now stepping up their responsibility to starting to implement or develop reparation programs for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. Colombia is one of them. Kosovo, of course, started a few years ago. Guinea is contemplating a reparation program for survivors. Ukraine is an important one also in relation to what you said, Madeleine. We're working with the government of Ukraine on establishing an interim reparation program for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. And this law, the law underpinning this program, is actually drafted with survivors, with women, are actually led by majority of women, I dare say. It's a seed, I think, a seed of change. Another important one, I just want to draw your attention to the last Security Council resolution, if I'm not mistaken, 2467, which really calls on member states to make remedy available for survivors. And that is in post-conflict settings, but also in conflict settings. And this is where the international community can really come in, providing interim reparation for survivors while a conflict is even ongoing. So that's just a topic I want to bring out there. Then the second part of the question, how to prioritize not only this topic, but women, peace and security in general. Of course, we cannot deny the importance of investing, and that comes with finances, and the finances are currently not there. We need to step up flexibly, generously, but also innovatively. Innovatively, for example, we can think about repurposing the assets that are confiscated of those that are associated with the crimes, including conflict-related sexual violence. That's a topic for another day. I would love a dialogue within the impact group on this topic. It's really an important one, but for now, I'll leave it at that and just express my enthusiasm for this group. And I can only attest to everything what you're saying about the alchemy, and let's make that work.
Thank you so much, Esther. And so now I'd like to move on to Ambassador Nathalie Chouard, who is the director of DCAF, the Geneva Centre for Security Sector Governance, just our sister organisation next door. So Ambassador Chouard, would you like to share your perspectives on why now, why here? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me here. Yes, DCAF is an organization that is dedicated to make state and people safer, and through more effective and accountable justice and security. And why women, peace and security is important, and even more important than ever, because we do believe that impactful, effective and efficient security sector governance can only be achieved if everyone is included. So obviously that means women, that means youth, that means also the other groups that have been mentioned, minority, marginalized group. And in our sense, it's really why good governance requires gender equality and a constant gender mainstreaming effort. So for us at DCAF, gender equality is not only a strategic goal, it is a core priority, and it's also very much included and gets the intention of our operation. So we have made a choice, as Thomas said at the beginning, we have to make a choice now. So we really made gender a central part of our strategic and corporate priorities. And we have that for this year, but also that will be the focus of our next strategy for the years 25-29. And within the framework of my commitment as an international gender champion, we have also created a gender focal network that really is active now, and that's really contributing to making gender as part of our result-based management so that all our projects can be also accountable against an international standard, the OECD DAC gender marker. But it's also really important to have an impact at the operational level, really on the ground. And there we are trying to integrate a gender perspective across regional and thematic areas. And beyond the gender mainstreaming in our work, we have also developed gender-specific projects and programs, many of which are closely linked to the VPS agenda, and that's 5 of the 10 UN Security Council resolutions that refer to security sector reform. So I do agree that we need to connect really the policy and the practice, and really develop really programs and projects that can support that. And in our case, we have supported gender responsive police and armed forces reform, for instance, in Colombia and Honduras. And we're also part of the ELSI initiative, that is this global program to enhance women meaningful participation in peacekeeping. But I really want to say that for me, it's about really creating this impact on the ground. It's also about connecting these dots between the policy and the practice, but that's also part of creating the trust that is so important now, and that we are speaking so much also in the multilateral arena. Because I mean, the first reaction of the first connection you have normally as a member of a community is with the police, and it's what's creating this trust on the longer run between also the state and the people. So that's also where we see achieving good gender responsive and security sector governance and implementing the women, peace and security as mutually reinforcing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Chouard. And I know that the team at DCAF has grown year by year, and it really is becoming, or has become, a very central part of your work. So with that, we'd like to turn online. We have 2 champions joining us online who cannot be here in person. So we have Ambassador Fuentes Julia from Chile, and we also have Catherine Marie-Uhel from the IIIM mechanism, the International Independent Impartial Mechanism for Investigating Crimes in Syria. So if you could briefly share with us why you feel this is so important to prioritise now. I know you're investigating a lot of crimes that have been committed in Syria, working with civil society, and you have a gender strategy. So we're curious to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Fleur, for giving me this opportunity. And let me start by saying that the objective of the Women, Peace and Security Impact Group was its focus on strengthening cooperation, supporting implementation, and developing evidence-based policy recommendations that are really fully in line with the IIIM's own right-based and victim survivor-centered approach. Our mandate, as a number of you know, is that of a justice facilitator, and we assist others, namely law enforcement, prosecutor, judges in competent jurisdiction, in the investigation and prosecution of core international crimes. And our basic assumption has always been that the most important part of this facilitating role is helping to connect the dots between various accountability stakeholders in what really is a lively ecosystem of actors, UN and other international entities, member states, civil society organizations, and of course, many individuals. And a key part of this, in which we've been able to play an important role, has been to promote and leverage the role of civil society actors, including women in particular. They've not only become more important sources of information and evidence in the context of the Syrian conflict, but they are also playing a crucial role at all stages of the justice process, starting with the strengthening of our own methodology and analysis in the context of our structural investigation into core crimes committed in Syria and their gendered aspect. So let me briefly share a few examples of how we can do that. Well, first of all, we consulted women representatives of civil society organizations and victim survivor groups of core international crimes committed in Syria when we developed and publicized our own gender strategy that you referred to, Fleur, and on which we have also reported to the International Gender Champions Group. We see the importance of consulting them when seeking to support broader justice objectives that are enshrined in our mandate and that go beyond mere judicial opportunities. And just to name a few, issues such as clarifying the fate of missing persons, so important in the context of Syria, but also housing, land and property rights, education and health, all have obvious and important justice dimensions and strongly gendered aspects. We consult them too prior to and as we engage in support of new justice opportunities. They inform us of the barriers they face in accessing justice, and we learn from those that are able to play an active part as parties in proceedings. They also help us shape certain aspects of our support to jurisdictions. Looking now at the idea of the impact group, really I'm convinced that it can become an additional catalyst in helping to connect the dots, as I mentioned earlier. It can create new conversations among various mandates, perspectives, and issues that are closely intertwined and need to be thought further. Syria is a prime example of a situation where such collective and forward-looking efforts are more needed than ever and are the starting point for comprehensive, inclusive, and even hopefully down the road, transformative justice. I thank you.
So we'll turn now to our second speaker online, which is Ambassador of Chile, Ambassador Claudia Fuentes Julia. So over to Ambassador, if you're there.
Thank you. Yes, I'm here. I've been listening. First, my apologies for not being with you in person, despite the fact that I'm in Geneva. But it seems to be that, that I go to one place to another today. So I didn't have the chance, but I didn't want to miss it because I'm really extremely excited to be part of this group and I have a personal commitment on this issue. And of course, Chile with our new feminist foreign policy is something that we would like to be seen and more implemented in the international arena. So since there is not a lot of time, I would like to focus on why this matters, and in particular, why the agenda of women and peace and security matters today, and why we should bring this conversation to Geneva. So why this matter? And I would like to point out a couple of ideas. First, and facts and evidence. First, as many reports have been pointing out, there is a rising conflict and, of course, a changing nature in international conflicts. Unfortunately, conflicts are now more in terms of numbers. They're also more violent. They're also even longer. This is a trend that has been present for at least a decade today, and it's a trend that is a concern for the international community. Of course, these new trends in conflict has catastrophic effects on people and society, as mass atrocities and crimes against humanity are also committed in this context. Also, conflict has dramatic, as you have seen, humanitarian consequences. 1/4 of humanity lives in conflict-affected zones. Conflict is also a driver of displacement. So in the new agenda for peace of the Secretary General, he states that we have more than 108 million people forcibly displaced. I believe that this number is even higher. Women, of course, are disproportionately affected by conflict. And just to give an example, and we see this every day in the news, the UN Women Report on the gender impact on the war on Gaza states that 70% of the Palestinian civilians that have been a casualty of the conflict are women and children. More than 1 million of women and girls have been displaced in Gaza as well. So at the same time, we also see gender-based violence and sexual violence as a weapon of war, which I'm not going to dig into this because I understand that this is actually the topic of the next panel. But I think what is important here that in many cases, these crimes, gender-based violence and sexual violence in context of war have remained in impunity and not even recognized as a human rights violation. I think this is changing, and this is why your discussion about the role of ICC is so important in that matter. And a third aspect in terms of why this matter is because we see that all these changes in conflicts also takes place in broader changes that we have perceived here in the multilateral arena, which is a general backlash against human rights, and in particular against women's rights. I don't have time to go into this, but later we can also discuss. But I think this is a real concern, and we have seen how, even language that we see recognized as by consensus, we are ended up defending it very forcibly, and in most times we even going backwards. This is a concern that we have here in multilateral Geneva as well. So this is why we believe that this is the time that states, societies, and of course the United Nations takes action to move to transform gender norms and institutional settings that have been perpetuating exclusion of women. Why Geneva? And let me end up with this. I think because for too long, issues related to peace have remained in the realm of a very thin definition of security, while human rights, remain in a different front. They go in two different tracks. Normally, issues related to peace are seen more from from its perspective in New York. Issues related to human rights and humanitarian issues are, the realm of Geneva, to put it in a way. I think, as many of my predecessors have indicated, this is time to connect the dots. I think this is a false dichotomy. And I think this is why it's so important to, move the women, peace and security towards Geneva. I believe there is a time to really look effectively at the realization of the 3 UN pillars, which is development, peace, and human rights. This is a call that has been clearly stated by the Secretary General in its agenda for peace. But unfortunately, I think we have been having serious difficulties in terms of how to implement that. I believe it is the time actually to bring that agenda in Geneva, to have a broader notion of security, a notion of also peace that is more a notion of peace that is more structural, and is also less thin notion of peace, and so that we can move forward to this agenda in Geneva. I believe that the prevention and protection of violence against women in particular has been a central theme of feminist movements. This is something that has been pointed out by the previous speakers, but unfortunately, this has been an agenda that is more difficult for states to implement. We need a broader vision of security with a gender perspective, as envisioned, I believe, in the Women, Peace and Security agenda, but it has been difficult to implement. But it should include root causes of conflict, also include structural causes that feed insecurities as many women and men feel. These insecurities, of course, are linked to inequalities in access to decision-making, in access to power, in control of resources, and at the same time, everything that is related to access to reproductive health, reproductive freedom, of course, and social protection of women. And in general, I see there is a general lack of guarantee of human rights. So my point here is that Geneva is in a critical time to bring the women, peace and security agenda in. We should have a broader understanding of what peace means, what conflict prevention means, and how conflict prevention is critically related to the implementation of basic human rights. And I think this is the right setting to do that. After 20 years of women, peace and security, it's time to bring conflict prevention right into our arena here in Geneva. Let me finish by saying that Chile is very committed to this agenda. We have been supporting the Women, Peace and Security agenda, of course, throughout this more than 20 years since it started. And we believe that we should move forward toward a broader Women, Peace and Security agenda, looking forward to better implement human rights in multilateral Geneva. Of course, this goes in line to our newly implemented feminist foreign policy. And I'm looking forward to your comments.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. It's been great to have you with us. I know you've had an extremely packed day, so we really appreciate you making the time. This concludes part 2. I think in summary, we've seen how we've got not just the prevention angle here in Geneva with the human rights, but we're also seeing the consequences with all the humanitarian responses. And it is the moment where we can come together, we can create stronger visions, stronger collaborations, and address the root causes. The geopolitics are there, but also the human rights mechanisms and the structures are here. So let's work together. So thank you so much for all your commitment and your words. And I'd like to now hand over to Adriana Quinones and Samuel M&A. Adriana's going to start by sharing a few words on the Women, Peace, Security, Humanitarian Action Compact, which is a very comprehensive roadmap to take us in the right direction. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being with us today. My name is Adriana Quiñones. I'm Head of Human Rights and Development of the Geneva UN Women's Office. And it's a pleasure to join you today. I, first of all, want to thank the Gender Champions for this initiative, Women, Peace and Security Impact Group, and congratulate you on the achievements that we will have together. UN Women is the lead entity of the UN system, supporting member states to implement their commitments and obligations in relation to the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Around the world, we are working with states and civil society organizations to develop national action plans on women, peace and security, to increase the number of women in peace processes and to pursue justice with and for survivors of gender-based violence, amongst many other activities. Our work on women, peace and security cuts across all 4 pillars of the agenda: participation, protection, prevention, and peace building and recovery, and all the 10 Security Council resolutions. The Women, Peace and Security agenda is rooted in the shared understanding that gender inequality undermines peace and makes individuals, communities, and societies less safe. One of the most extreme manifestations of gender inequality is the crime of gender persecution, the severe deprivation of a fundamental right on the basis of one's gender. If we as the international community can identify and pursue accountability for gender persecution, we can send a clear message that gender-based discrimination will not be tolerated. And when we send this message, we take steps to address gender inequality as a cause of conflict. In this group, we would like to expand on the Compact of Women, Peace and Security and Humanitarian Action, that it's working to realize a world for women and girls where conflict and crisis is prevented. There are 4 strategic actions in the Compact: financing, participation of women in peace processes, economic security, leadership and agency, and protection of human rights. To succeed, peace and humanitarian action processes need to include women's perspectives and uphold their human rights. Since its launch at the Generation Equality Forum in 2021, the Compact has welcomed more than 200 signatories, including countries, regional organizations, UN entities, and civil society, women and youth organizations and networks, academic institutions, and the private sector. Together, this multi-stakeholder process is driving 5 years of transformative action for sustainable and inclusive peace through strong partnerships, improved monitoring, and through strong assessment of progress and a focus on financing and advocacy. Here in Geneva, UN Women is committed to supporting member states to bring the commitments and the spirit of the Women, Peace and Security agenda into the Human Rights Council. We believe that the Women, Peace and Security Impact Group has the great potential of bringing together implementation and the enhancement of the agenda for women and girls around the world. Also, UN Women has been long a champion for accountability on the crime of gender persecution. In 2020, we partnered with Justice Rapid Response to support academic research on gender persecution. We launched a toolkit that I invite all of you to look at in our website on gender persecution. You can find it online. And in 2022, UN Women supported the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court to develop his office's policy on gender persecution. We hosted an expert consultation and submitted written comments to the drafting process. Thanks to the work of experts, practitioners, and scholars like Valerie Osterveld, and an understanding and awareness of the crime of gender persecution as it grows, we see increasing references to it in the reports of the Human Rights Council. For example, the Special Rapporteur on Afghanistan focused extensively on gender persecution in his report in June 2023, and the Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia also found gender persecution in the September 2023 report. I believe we can expect these references to continue the council session that begins in a few weeks, and UN Women is very proud to play a small role in this increasing recognition of the crime, in the hopes that we can work together to pursue accountability for perpetrators, victims, and survivors. So the growing interest on the crime of gender persecution has been particularly helpful for the work of UN Women's Office in Afghanistan. In July 2023, UN Women convened an expert meeting to discuss human rights, political and diplomatic tools for addressing Afghanistan's unprecedented women's rights crisis. Gender persecution was, of course, one of the focuses of the discussion, along with the evolving concept of gender apartheid. The outcomes of the expert meeting can also be found online in our Afghanistan country office website. From Geneva, one of the ways in which UN Women works on the Women, Peace and Security agenda is by providing technical support and expertise to the commissions of inquiry in the Human Rights Council. Investigations in partnership with Justice Rapid Response. We do this to ensure that the investigations have dedicated expertise to investigate sexual and gender-based violence, analyze the gender impact of human rights violations, and in this regard, I'm very pleased to be introducing in the discussion Samuel Emonet, Executive Director of Justice Rapid Response, knowing that we could not be doing this work without JRR. So my pleasure is to hand the floor to Samuel.
Adriana, thank you very much. I'm very honored to introduce that conversation about the crime of gender persecution today. And it's also a great pleasure to have online, and we will hear her in a minute, Professor Valérie Oosterveld, who has been working so much on that notion and concept. So I understand that you came more to hear her than me, so I'll be short in my remarks, don't worry. I'm going to just say three things. The first thing is that the timing of that session today is really important, because soon the International Criminal Court will issue a verdict in the Al-Hassan case. Mr. Al-Hassan has been accused of crimes against humanity, including for acts of gender persecution that took place in Mali between 2012 and 2013. It will be the first ruling of the International Criminal Court on persecutions on grounds of gender as a crime against humanity. And regardless of the outcome of the verdict, be it a verdict of culpability or a verdict of innocence, I think for all of us that are concerned with gender equality and gender justice, this is going to be an important moment to follow. And this is why hearing Valérie Oosterveld educate us about that crime today is really important, because we will hear what the verdict is in a few weeks or a few months. We don't know the date exactly. The second thing I wanted to say is that accountability for the crime of gender persecution can only be achieved if you adopt a gender-sensitive and a gender-competent approach from the first moment you start the investigation into those crimes, and then throughout the justice process. If you don't do it, what will happen is that you are going to fail to identify those crimes, so you are going to miss opportunities for accountability. If you don't take this gender-sensitive approach, what will happen is that you are going to leave behind whole groups of victims and survivors, and then yourself, as an actor of the justice process, yourself create discrimination against these groups. Not to speak about the fact that if you approach investigation and justice with a gender-sensitive lens, you will better understand the root cause of the conflict and then contribute to peace down the road. So for all these reasons, and Adriana spoke about this, so I won't repeat this, for the past 10 years, Justice Rapid Response, UN Women, we have pushed for the adoption of a gender-sensitive approach in all human rights and criminal justice investigations. To do this, we have extensively used the roster of experts that we have built together to deploy that expertise to the Human Rights Council, ICC, and others. And precisely in the Al-Hassan case, in 2014, the Office of the Prosecutors asked us for support in their investigation team with somebody who was a professional in investigating gender-based crimes. And as it turned out, the prosecutor used that expert, and the work of that expert contributed to the first confirmation of charges for gender persecution in 2019. And so the work that we do together is not limited to international justice or human rights bodies. It's also supporting domestic jurisdiction, civil society organization, almost systematically with the gender lens. What we learn from this is that advancing gender justice is really a collective effort. And that's why I really welcome the creation of the WPS Impact Group, because this is going to bring us together and make us even more efficient and help us continue that effort. That is a big effort. We are far from, as we heard before, from succeeding now. If there is one person that has worked almost whole her life on those questions and issues and advanced gender justice, that's Professor Valérie Oosterveld, who is joining us today online. And so I think she hardly needs an introduction. I'm just going to say to you a few words. Professor Oosterveld has been recently appointed as the Special Advisor on Crimes Against Humanity to the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. She's also the Western Research Chair in International Criminal Justice and also a professor in the Faculty of Law of Western Ontario University in Canada. She has published extensively on accountability for international crimes and gender-based crimes. She has also served on delegations of the Canadian government in the negotiation of ICC-related treaties, including the Rome Statute. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you, Professor Oosterveld. When we prepared that session, we agreed that you will tell us about three things. The first one is help us understand that crime of gender persecution and why it's relevant for gender justice. Second, tell us how it's been used in the prosecution of the Alassane case or other cases that you think are relevant. And finally, if you could tell us about the consequences of the trial judgment that's going to come up in the future, be it a culpability or innocence judgment, what are the consequences for gender justice? Professor Oosterveld, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a real pleasure to be able to join you virtually today. I apologize that my schedule doesn't allow me to be present with you in Geneva. I'm joining you from London, Ontario, Canada, which is not only where my university is situated, it's also the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Chinongton Indigenous nations. Before I begin, I'll mention that the role of the Special Advisor to the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, or ICC, is an independent one. I therefore do not speak on behalf of the prosecutor or his staff. Samuel mentioned that I'll speak on three topics today, so I'm going to jump in on the first topic. What is the crime against humanity of gender persecution? Persecution is listed as a crime against humanity in Article 7(1)(g) of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. It involves the intentional and severe deprivation of fundamental rights against an identifiable group or collectivity on prohibited discriminatory grounds. And the central distinguishing feature of persecution is that it must be committed on discriminatory grounds. Now, persecution has been recognized as a crime against humanity for over 75 years. It was included in the list of prohibited acts comprising crimes against humanity in the Nuremberg and Tokyo Tribunal Charters, and then again in Control Council Law Number 10 after World War II. In the early 1990s, it was also listed in the statutes of the International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and in other court mandates, such as the 2002 statute of the Special Court for Sierra Leone. Now, all of those statutes focused on political, racial, or religious persecution. And the 1998 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court contains an updated and more inclusive list of prohibited grounds: political, racial, national, ethnic, cultural, religious, gender, and other grounds that are universally recognized as impermissible under international law. So the Rome Statute of the ICC was the first to include persecution carried out on gender grounds as a crime against humanity. Now, of course, international refugee law had long recognized persecution, including on gender grounds, but this was the first as a crime against humanity. This ground was included in the Rome Statute in recognition of how international law, particularly human rights law, had evolved to include a deeper understanding of various forms of gender discrimination, including when discrimination tips over into gender persecution, as we've been talking about today. Now, a moment ago, I mentioned the key elements of persecution: the intentional and severe deprivation of fundamental rights, contrary to international law, by reason of the identity of the group or collectivity on prohibited discriminatory grounds. For gender persecution, that targeting must be based on gender, which is defined in the Rome Statute. The term gender is defined in the Rome Statute as the two sexes, male and female, within the context of society. So it's a rather skeletal definition. But it does capture the fact that gender is socially constructed and is centered around norms of maleness or femaleness from the point of view of the perpetrator. In 2022, the ICC prosecutor adopted a policy on the crime of gender persecution, which you've heard referenced already today. That policy augments this definition of gender by indicating that gender refers to sex characteristics and social constructs and criteria used to define maleness and femaleness, including roles, behaviors, activities, and attributes. And as a social construct, gender varies within societies and from society to society and can change over time. And the prosecutor's 2023 revised policy paper on gender-based crimes adopts the same approach. Now, gender persecution is very interesting because it is an explanatory and a linking type of crime. What I mean by this is that a charge of gender persecution can be used to help explain why many of the other crimes charged took place in a given conflict or mass atrocity situation. For example, the crimes against humanity and war crimes of murder or willful killing, torture, and rape. And gender persecution as a charge can also help to explain how such crimes took place, because it links together the crimes into a clear and understandable pattern. Now, gender persecution is also interesting as a charge because it can include other conduct that severely deprives political, civil, economic, or social rights. So, for example, the passing of gender discriminatory laws, the restriction of movement and seclusion of women and girls, the exclusion of women, girls, and LGBTQIA individuals from aspects of political, social, or economic life, including exclusion from professions, from business, from educational institutions, and from public service. And gender persecution also intersects often with other forms of persecution. So, for example, in laws prohibiting or regulating intermarriage among ethnic, religious, or other groups. The Appeals Chamber of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda has held that while hate speech alone does not constitute persecution, hate speech and calls to violence that contribute to acts of violence, including against women and girls, can be of comparable gravity to other crimes and constitute acts of persecution. And other types of human rights violations that can potentially fall within persecution include attacks on property, such as private dwellings, businesses, and symbolic buildings. So think about bars or restaurants where gay men or trans individuals may gather, or maternity hospitals, or girls' schools. And in this way, gender persecution can be seen as a bridge between human rights law on non-discrimination on the one hand and international criminal law on the other. So I'll turn now to the case of prosecutor and Al-Hassan at the International Criminal Court. This is a case that opened in July 2020 and closed in May of 2023. The trial judgment was originally scheduled to be released last month in January, but was rescheduled to a future date due to the illness of the presiding judge, and the new date for the release of the judgment has not yet been set. As Samuel mentioned, Al-Hassan is the first case in which the crime against humanity of gender persecution has been litigated by the ICC. And the ICC is the first international tribunal to have jurisdiction over this crime. And this makes it a very important case to watch. The persecution charge, I should mention, also includes religious persecution, as the prosecutor alleged that victims were targeted both for their gender and for their religious beliefs. And this approach is understandable. Victims' identities often intersect, and persecution is often carried out on multiple discriminatory grounds. In Al-Hassan, the prosecutor alleges that both gender and religious persecution took place during the 10 months the city of Timbuktu, Mali, was under the control of two armed groups, Ansar Dine and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. And this took place from 2012 to 2013. And the prosecution argues that Al-Hassan was a prominent figure in this occupation, serving as a member of Ansar Dine and the de facto chief of the Islamic police. The defense argues that he was not, in fact, a prominent figure in the occupation. Al-Hassan is charged by the prosecutor with 13 counts of crimes against humanity and war crimes under the Rome Statute, including, as I've mentioned, the charge of gender-based persecution as a crime against humanity. But I wanted to mention that a number of the other charges relate to sexual and gender-based offenses. For example, rape as a crime against humanity or war crime, sexual slavery as a crime against humanity and war crime, and forced marriages as an inhumane act under crimes against humanity. And gendered forms of violence also underlie other charges, such as torture and cruel treatment. And I mention all of these other charges because they are used by the prosecutor to create the necessary framework of fundamental rights violations to support the gender persecution charge. The prosecutor argued that the two armed groups sought to enforce their extremist interpretation of Sharia law and their narrow conception of acceptable gender roles by imposing numerous conditions on the citizens of Timbuktu. And many of these rules particularly targeted women and girls. So, for example, the prosecution put forward evidence that female citizens were required to adhere to a strict dress code covering their heads and bodies. They were banned from wearing traditional clothes or jewelry, were prohibited from being alone at night, or speaking with men other than their husbands. They were prevented from going out at night or to school with boys. So there are many, many rules around what women and girls could do in Timbuktu at this point in time. And witnesses testified that the perceived violation of these rules by women and girls led to heavy consequences. As the prosecution put it, women and girls were hunted down in the streets, in the schools, in hospitals, and sometimes even in their own homes. They were beaten, arrested, imprisoned under inhumane conditions, and raped if they did not comply. And the prosecution maintained throughout the trial that Al-Hassan was involved in a range of gendered fundamental rights violations, such as forced marriages, sexual slavery, and rape, among others. The prosecution brought evidence that women and girls were raped while being held in detention by the Islamic police and within the context of forced marriages. As one of the prosecutors said in the closing argument, Let me take one example among others where a victim narrated that she had been arrested. And what was her fault? Her veil had simply fallen or dropped. She was taken to the BMS, which was the detention site of the Islamic police. She was raped by 3 men in turn. She was only 13 years old. The prosecution argued that these rapes were a predictable consequence of the coercive environment in the occupied city and the result of the intentional plan of Ansar Dine and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, who sought to impose their power and control over women and girls. And the prosecution also referred to a pattern of sexual slavery associated with the forced marriage system instituted by these 2 armed groups. The system provided local women and girls to fighters as so-called wives, which helped to circumvent the ban on sexual relations outside of marriage and strengthened the control and integration of both armed groups in Timbuktu at the time. The prosecution argued that Al-Hassan was instrumental in facilitating sexual slavery and forced marriage and personally organized a number of these so-called marriages. The defense of Al-Hassan countered that the prosecution did not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that there was a culpable link between Al-Hassan and any of the crimes. In other words, the defense was saying that the link between Al-Hassan and these crimes was not present, not proven by the prosecution. The defense also argued that Al-Hassan did not know about the sexual or gender-based violence, and he did not play a role in precipitating or exacerbating the effects. So as you can hear, as between the prosecution and the defense, much of the evidence brought against Al-Hassan by the prosecution is linkage evidence. That linkage evidence was meant to demonstrate indirect criminal responsibility by positioning him as the origin or the catalyst for the crimes that were charged. So the success of the gender persecution and gendered crimes charges largely rests on this evidence. And in the closing statement, the prosecution argued that Al-Hassan was an important link between the crimes that happened on the ground and the carrying out of the work of the Islamic police, that he had become omnipresent and indispensable within the Islamic police. The prosecution pointed to evidence of telephone data, witness statements, police reports, personal notes, crisis committee reports, committees representing the inhabitants of the city, videos, and expert reports. They argued that Al-Hassan was present throughout the chain of repression. He was a key figure in authority who was personally involved in all of the tasks and an important component in the overall system of persecution. The defense contends that Al-Hassan did not have the decision-making power or the influence attributed to him by the prosecution, stating that, quote, that he was not just a little fish, he was plankton within the Timbuktu ecosystem. He was part of the civilian population in Timbuktu and had no role in the decision-making apparatus of Ansar Dine. He neither influenced nor controlled the charged crimes. Now, of course, we do not know the evaluation of the trial judges of this evidence of the prosecution or of the defense yet, until the judgment is released in the coming weeks. But turning to my last point today, we can still talk about the implications of the Al-Hassan case. Even though the trial judgment is not yet issued and there is not a verdict, the Al-Hassan case has already been instructive in a couple of ways with respect to the charge of gender persecution. First, it has shown one type of circumstance in which such a charge may be relevant, either for the ICC or for domestic prosecutions. That is, when armed groups overtake a civilian area and impose gender discriminatory laws or rules. The evidence learned in this case in investigating, framing, and explaining the charge could be helpful in the ICC's Afghanistan and Nigeria situations, for example. Second, this case has given a sense of how to explain to judges that gender persecution is a crime that overarches other crimes. In other words, how to contextualize gender persecution. The other crimes, such as rape, torture, sexual slavery, and others, are nested within gender persecution. They are the means through which gender persecution is carried out, as well as through violations of human rights norms, as I had mentioned earlier. So, the context of gender discrimination can explain why the other crimes have taken place, and may explain the choice of crime by the perpetrators. Depending on the judicial reasoning, the judgment in Al-Hassan has the potential to be a landmark in the recognition of gender persecution and its underlying gender discriminatory acts. It is the first step in operationalizing the ICC prosecutor's policy on the crime of gender persecution, and indicative of increased global attention to this crime. We see this in the insightful discussion of gender persecution throughout the gender strategy of the IIIM, which Catherine alluded to earlier. We also see it in the German case against ISIL member Sarah O., who was convicted of the crime against humanity of persecution of Yazidi victims on intersecting grounds of religion and gender. And we see it in the ways in which Colombia's special jurisdiction for peace is utilizing gender persecution in cases involving LGBTQ individuals. Deputy head of the IIIM, Michelle Jarvis, whom some of you may know, has noted, "These are signs of a growing commitment to addressing gender as a discriminatory driver of violence and atrocity, and key tools in the quest for more inclusive justice outcomes that empower victims and survivors." After all, she asks, if we do not specifically identify and condemn the discriminatory drivers of crimes, what hope do we have of dismantling them as part of our quest for an atrocity-free, more peaceful world? And I'll end my remarks with two observations. First, gender persecution is currently included in the draft Crimes Against Humanity Convention being discussed in the 6th Committee at the United Nations in New York. Moving that discussion towards adoption is, in my view, important, as it can create a legal framework for domestic prosecution of gender persecution and potentially reparations around the world. And gender persecution charges can help to capture the full range of criminality that can be covered in prosecutions and are often reflected in other charges and can serve to help redress impunity gaps. And most importantly, charging gender persecution can help highlight harms that are often obscured. And also to end, in Geneva, gender persecution can also continue to be reflected in human rights resolutions, mandates of commissions of inquiry, and otherwise, as has already been mentioned. There is more work to do on gender persecution, well beyond the work of the International Criminal Court. It is clear. Thank you.
Professor Rustovel, thank you so much for that presentation. It reminded me a little bit of Madeleine's and I think Esther's comment about connecting the dots. So it's really interesting to see how the crime of gender persecution connects to human rights with criminal justice, and that was very interesting to hear. So we are lucky to have about 10 minutes to take a few questions either from the room or from online. So I receive them online on my phone. And if somebody in the rooms wants, we can start in the room, maybe take 1 or 2 questions. Yes, thank you. I think you can speak freely because they opened the mics in the room. Valérie, tell us if you hear.
Thank you very much. It was very insightful, and maybe my question will be also a bit simple, or maybe it will be difficult, so whoever wants to address it. But judging from the people present in this room today and from the panelists, how do you think we can include more men into the conversation?
Maybe we can take 2 questions. I think they can be addressed to Professor Osterveld. Professor, did you hear the question? Or do you want me to repeat it?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Yes, I did.
So how do we include more men in the conversation? Is there another question? Yes.
Guys as well. Hi, my name is Charlotte. I'm the gender advisor in the UK mission in Geneva here. Thank you all. This has been absolutely fantastic. I have a lot of questions, but I think I'll bravely ask the question on behalf of a member state, maybe for 2 or 3 concrete asks for states such as the UK. We sit on the Security Council, we sit in the Human Rights Council. You know, we try in integrating all of what you've said today, but some concrete asks such as the Crimes Against Humanity Convention that's been drafted, if anyone has any other recommendations. Thanks.
Professor Osterveld, do you want to answer the 2 questions?
Sure, although I suspect that there are others in the room as well who have some thoughts on all of these questions. So on the first question of how to involve more men in these discussions of gender issues, I'll give one concrete possibility. And that is that the prosecutor has launched a consultation process to create what he calls principles on gender persecution. And this consultation process is going to last most of this year until November. I would urge men and women and all sorts of groups to be involved in that consultation process. And I think that it is very important for those groups who are doing convenings on gender persecution principles to ensure that they include men and male points of view, as well as LGBTQIA and women and girls points of views in the outreach that is going to be associated with the consultations on those gender persecution principles. So that's one thought, one concrete thought. With respect to the second question about concrete ways in which action can be taken, I think we already have on the table a number of different ways that have been set out today at this event. So I will reiterate 2, and I apologize for repeating myself, but I do think it's important to think strategically around these 2. So I realize that the discussions on the Crimes Against Humanity Convention are happening in New York and not Geneva. But I think it's really important for everyone in Geneva to keep an eye on that process. And that is because feminist groups have been one of the only sort of sets of groups that have been paying attention to the drafting of the Crimes Against Humanity Convention, which is fantastic. And it would be really helpful for the work that they are doing, which is to try to ensure that convention is as gender sensitive and gender competent as possible, is supported from afar and not only within the confines of the rooms in New York in which the 6th committee is meeting. And secondly, I do think, just like you all pay attention to women, peace, and security as resolutions are being drafted in Geneva, in the Human Rights Council and elsewhere, if you could also consider as part of that, ensuring that gender persecution is reflected in those resolutions. So for example, in the mandates of commissions of inquiry, I think that would help give a boost to ensuring that the full range of gender discriminatory acts that have happened in any given conflict or mass atrocity situation are paid attention to. Now, I realize that it was a colleague from the United Kingdom mission who was asking these questions, and the United Kingdom is already involved in very supportive of the Crimes Against Humanity Convention, and particularly in making sure that it is gender sensitive. So I'm not telling you something that you don't already know, but everyone can pay attention in a similar way. Thank you.
Are we good for another round of questions and then we close? I just want to mention one initiative to answer the question. There is an initiative hosted or supported by the Netherlands in Geneva called Men Engage. And they are sort of sensitizing men to the idea of gender equality. And I can share the reference if you want. So this gave you the time to think of another question or two. Yes?
Thank you. Thanks very much for the presentation, Professor. The UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls and the Special Rapporteur on Afghanistan, among others, have identified the need to develop the normative framework around the crime of gender apartheid, complementing the crime of gender persecution. So I wonder if you have reflections on the ways in which the specific crime of gender apartheid might complement the crime of gender persecution and ways to advance that agenda normatively, including through the draft articles on crimes against humanity being negotiated by the 6th Committee.
Thank you very much. I have been watching with interest the discussions around gender apartheid that have been happening in the context of the drafting of the Crimes Against Humanity Convention in the 6th Committee in New York. The way I look at gender persecution and gender apartheid is that at the moment, because gender apartheid is not specifically referenced in international criminal law, it's already included within gender persecution. However, there are those who are advocating with respect to gender apartheid point out that in international criminal law, there is a principle called fair labeling. And it is very important to ensure that any particular crime is fairly and accurately labeled. And they are proposing the label of gender apartheid to capture the institutionalized natures of gender discrimination. So within gender persecution, there is often a structural nature. But they are arguing for a more fulsome recognition of the institutionalized nature. So I think it is, and could be a step forward in the discussions with respect to the Crimes Against Humanity Convention. And we will see in April how this unfolds, and then again in October how this unfolds in the 6th Committee and whether there's purchase amongst states. There's already been some purchase amongst some states, but whether that expands will be something to keep an eye on.
I will close the session. Professor Osterle, thank you so much for joining us so early there in Canada. Adriana, it was great to share that panel with you, and this is a testament to our partnership. I think it's great. Right. And thank you for inviting us.
Just very briefly from my side, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My particular gratitude goes to our speakers for making this discussion so rich. There is clearly a lot more to be discussed and to be done. And I hope that this impact group will be able to make a tangible difference to the way the WTS agenda is perceived and acted upon here in Geneva and beyond. We'll be hosting further meetings and events this year, and so do follow us on the IGC and GCSP's website and social media channels. Have a nice afternoon. Thank you so much. Thanks, Emmanuel. Thank you.
Thank you so much.